Right, so thank you. It's really good to be with you here today. So I'm very pleased to give you an update on what my approach is in terms of the mental health work that we're doing in government. Also, as has been alluded to, suicide prevention, which is clearly a significant issue, particularly the impact on men. And also, as has also been mentioned, I'm also responsible for inequalities. So I tend to look at all these issues from various perspectives, be it race, be it gender, and so on. So it's actually very interesting to have just listened to the previous presentation. It's given me plenty of food for thought. So in respect of mental health, or should I say mental ill health, most of us, at some point in our lives, will go through a period of mental ill health. And it's important that we all have access to help when we need it. Most importantly, and this is where it particularly affects men, we also need to know it's okay to ask for help. Now, we know that men are less likely than women to talk about their feelings and seek help, and can be reluctant to engage with health and other support services. And that can lead to conditions getting worse. So by the time they do get to seek help, it can be, obviously, conditions can be much more progressed. And quite often, men fall through the support services altogether, hence why we have a higher rate of suicide amongst men more than women. Now, we know that men are often hard to reach, so we have to look at innovative ways of engaging with those men who need support. And we need to do so much more to tackle stigma. I think we've come a long way in society, that we are now much more willing to talk about mental health and mental ill health. It's actually been genuinely transformational. In some respects, that gives me more of a problem because it's unlocked lots of unmet demand for mental health services. But ultimately, we are going to get to a much healthier place if we continue to break down the stigma so that people start to think more actively about their mental well-being. Now, we do know that there are lots of local areas and initiatives that are showing really groundbreaking, innovative work trying to make themselves more accessible to men. And it's really about taking those services to where men go. So it's things like sporting venues, male-dominated workplaces. I've heard about some fantastic work being done by Everton Football Club, recognising that many men will be going to see a football match, and we can get those messages out about stigma in a non-threatening and a non-intimidating way. We hear that Kent County Council has been targeting men by providing confidential support through their Release the Pressure campaign. And again, it's just making it accessible so that it's not intimidating to go and ask. But I am particularly concerned in terms of my work on suicide prevention that suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. And this is the group that is at highest risk of suicide. So there is clearly much, much more to do. Every suicide is preventable. And the fact that we're having so many, 13 people a day taking their own lives is clearly something that we cannot afford as a society to ignore. So as I've already mentioned, we really do need to do more to tackle stigma. We know that men can struggle with not just a sense of shame when they're struggling with mental ill health, but just actually a lack of understanding of what's happening to them. We have a society that expects men to be the protectors, men to be in control, and quite often it's very difficult for men then to actually think about themselves, and that's something that I think we're going to have to take. It will take a long time because it's effectively a culture change that we're expecting men to do. But when you've witnessed people going through this, and we all know that there's particular triggers that can cause episodes of mental health, and they tend to be things of great emotional change. So relationship breakdown is clearly the most significant one, but there are other things too. And I've witnessed a member of my own family, actually, who in 1 year found himself retiring from work, losing a number of family members through bereavement, and moving house. And the combination of all those things really took control away from him. And you could witness the complete onset of anxiety because everything was not normal. And if you've never actually gone through that, it can be profoundly shocking. So we can't emphasize enough that it's okay not to feel okay all the time. And it's okay to feel like you can't cope. It's okay to admit that you're struggling. And I think we all need to encourage people also to reach out to people if we can see that someone's clearly in distress or not quite themselves. We all collectively need to make it much easier for people to ask for help. It's a cliche, but a problem shared is a problem halved, and we need to encourage more of that. So we will continue to provide funding for the National Time to Change initiative, which continues to play a key role in reducing mental health stigma. I will continue to make lots of noise about this, but we all collectively need to play our part. Now, we do have evidence that it's making a difference. Between 2008 and 2016, Time to Change reports that there is now much wider understanding and sympathy towards people with mental health issues and a much greater knowledge. We will be adding to that campaign later this year when we roll out some online tools that enable people to actually explore their mental health and mental well-being themselves. We really do need to encourage and support and amplify the work done by some of the voluntary sector groups that are out there doing this work, things like Andy's Man Clubs and Men's Sheds, State of Mind Sport. And I'm also giving my challenge to local clinical commissioning groups in the NHS to really look in terms of their work on suicide prevention and mental health, to properly engage with the voluntary sector about some of these services, because I think the other thing about mental health is a lot of the support you can get isn't necessarily clinical. It's a lot of that wraparound care that the voluntary sector can do so well. So I'm expecting NHS CCGs to directly commission services from the voluntary sector where that can be an additional support for men. I think I'd just like to say a few things now about addiction, because I mentioned relationship breakdown as a particular trigger, but it's also the case that addiction is a very substantial trigger. And although we all, many of us like a drink or like to have a flutter on the horses, clearly there are times when that becomes highly addictive and damaging behaviour. So we are really going to up our game in terms of the work that we're doing to tackle gambling addiction particularly, because that's something that has been neglected in the past. And according to the Health Survey for England, it's as high as 0.7% of people in England who identify themselves as problem gamblers. But we believe that the actual figure could be as much as 3.5%. So it is a particular risk factor. And we know that when people are going through periods of mental ill health, they will be more impulsive and will almost as a kind of self-medication, do that more risky behaviour. So again, all the more reason to do more to tackle those things. The previous talk talked a lot about, obviously, the nature of relationships, and we do know that good quality relationships are critical for every member of a family. Our relationships with our family members, with our friends and colleagues all contribute to how happy we are and to how our mental well-being continues. And we know that relationships are very complex and all relationships face their challenges at some point. But negative life events, including relationship breakdown, have a clear impact on our mental health. And I would say it's probably the most significant ingredient when it comes to suicide. So the concept of building stronger relationships and critically stronger families is what underpins so much of the government's work on this issue. So we are intervening to help families reduce parental conflict through the £39 billion Reducing Parental Conflict programme. This programme will encourage councils across England to integrate services and approaches which address parental conflict into their local services for families. And we're making good progress. So we've now got face-to-face interventions live in 25 local authorities. We'll be rolling out 6 more later this summer. We've also provided £2.2 million to 10 innovative projects under our Challenge Fund. And these will test different ways of providing support to disadvantaged families to reduce conflict, as well as digital approaches. And we've also launched the Children of Alcohol Dependent Parents Fund, which is funding projects in 9 other local authorities to support parents who misuse alcohol and experience parental conflict. And that's really important because, as we know, bad behaviours can be passed on from generation to generation. And when we look at where the state has contact with people, perhaps the bit we've neglected most is within the family. So we do need to do better. And I often look, and when I look at someone suffering severe mental ill health or someone going into prison, when you look at the life chances that that person's had, there's been numerous opportunities for the state to intervene and give support. So when it gets to that stage, the state has failed. But we can use the intelligence we're gathering from these projects to make sure that we can give intervention when it's most useful and at the earliest possible stage. I think central also with regard to within the family, we are investing significantly in perinatal mental health. And this is really important because the arrival of a child has a massive impact on family relationships. That tends to be the trigger for domestic abuse to start in many cases. And whilst we often look at perinatal mental health through the prism of women, we mustn't forget it through the prism of men also, because this is a life-changing experience. So our NHS long-term plan introduces new provisions to support families by committing to increasing support for husbands and partners of expectant and new mothers, including peer support and therapy sessions for couples, as well as other parenting interventions. And I think we need to stop, within the health service, stop seeing things as conditions and actually start seeing the person. And we have to see the person in that holistic context and holistic needs. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but the NHS manages everything through process to standardise service and quite often ends up doing things badly because we don't take full advantage of those opportunities to make a difference. So by 2024, we'll be significantly expanding perinatal mental health care by a further 24,000 people in addition to the 30 that we do already, 30,000. As I've mentioned, it is not right that 13 people still take their own life every day in England, and it is my priority as Minister for Suicide Prevention to make sure that we tackle that. I think one of the key messages I'd like to give is that so many of those, 2/3 of those people who take their own lives are not in contact with mental health services. But many of them have been to see their GP in the month before they take their lives. So we need to get so much better at giving support and seeing those opportunities to help. So I'm really pleased that we've just given £2 million to the Zero Suicide Alliance, which will be rolling out training throughout the NHS so that we make full use of the opportunity for intervention to prevent suicide. And really to offer that help to particularly men when they're not asking for it but showing signs of distress. We've also announced £1.8 million to support the Samaritans Helpline, which is clearly an established brand that people do go to and can go to anonymously. And I think the final point I'd like to make is that we've seen the impact of this stuff, technology, on society. And really the whole advent of social media and being in constant contact, I think, is bringing new mental health pressures, ones that we don't properly understand yet. But we are working very closely with all those companies to really having been prompted by particular suicides to make sure that they're doing their bit to do their bit in terms of prevention, but also to encourage good practice. So I think I'll leave it there. I just wanted to just totally emphasise that improving the nation's mental health is a key priority for this government. We're working very hard. We're working very hard from a low base because actually we haven't done enough in the past to protect people's mental health. But I'm really pleased to be doing this job, challenging though it is, and I'm really grateful for your interest, and I hope you have a very productive conference.
I'm Michael Lefkovich. I work for the charity Families Need Fathers. The Samaritans will have reported repeatedly about how many of the suicides of men are actually by fathers who've been denied the opportunity to maintain their relationships with their children. Very, very serious issue. We hear from these people all the time. They may or may not have been to their doctors. They probably have been. But it's not necessarily, I mean, of course they need support for their mental health. The problem actually is that you've got a system which doesn't support their involvement with their children when there is family conflict. It's good that we're dealing with a family conflict to reduce it, but when it occurs, the family justice system is too slow, tends towards supporting the mother, tends not to support paternal involvement, makes it really, really difficult. And whilst you've been speaking, I've just had a text from the chairman of Mankind Initiative, which is a male domestic abuse charity. You will be aware that the government announced a few weeks back that they were going to have a review of family courts and child protection. An expert panel has been appointed. It's been announced today that the expert panel includes Women's Aid, doesn't include a single men's organisation, even though we've inquired about involvement. I mean, how does that leave men feeling in terms of how they are valued when every time there is an issue which involves both genders, they tend to only want to talk to the women's organisations?
Okay. Well, in respect of the review that you've just mentioned, obviously that's something that will be taken forward by the Ministry of Justice, but it will be something that I will have...
Please approach them. I've got the letter with me. I've written to Paul Maynard, who's the new minister, and he's basically told us, we wrote within days of the announcement of the review, and he wrote back saying, we've already decided who's on it and you're not.
Okay, well, I can't... Yeah. That's not my. That's a different decision to me. But the point you make is a good one. You know, when we talk about relationship breakdown, I mean, when we talk about the age group of men that's really vulnerable to this, they've gone through their life, relationship breaks down, and suddenly it's this massive period of uncertainty. Like you say, they're not getting to see their children. Quite often, they're living in really poor housing, bed sits, and so on. And I think. You know, I think society needs to understand that this is a problem because I think, I wouldn't necessarily see it in a gendered way, but basically all the emphasis is on the child and the presumption is in favour of the mother. Although I have to say, my partner actually was awarded custody of his son rather than giving it to the mother, so it's not entirely uniform. But I think when we need to just be much better at looking at the family as a whole, not just seeing things through the prism of the child and in favour of the mother.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate you being here. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm a professor of masculinities and of sport. And I just want to give you something to chew on, and also for the audience that's probably not thought of this particular issue. In this country, according to the Freedom of Information requests I've done on hundreds of schools, 93% of schools across this country compel boys from age 11 to play contact collision rugby. It is the highest sport with a concussion rate. In the latest study of schools rugby, fully 10% of the boys had a concussion from just one season of play. And that's diagnosed concussion. Concussion's hard to diagnose. Yet studies on those who have concussion show they have 3 times higher long-term suicide rates. Concussion leads to 33 out of 100,000, so per 100,000, 33 suicides. So this country is compelling boys, even at 75.5% against their will, through the home-parent contract, to play tackle rugby in school systems. My research shows that 13% of primary school teachers have ever concussion training awareness, 1% for primary schools. And what you have is institutionalized child abuse that could be simply replaced with touch rugby. which would, by the way, also allow for mixed abilities. Now, a team of my scholars, of neurologists and sports scholars and medical doctors, have proposed this to the 4 chief medical officers. And their response to us was, we have no appetite to take contact rugby out of compelled PE because we are in an obesity epidemic. Of course, touch rugby has higher rates of cardiovascular. So, Jackie, what I'm trying to say is, what I heard you say was psychological, social processes that happen to men that lead them to not discuss the emotional. But what I didn't hear was the brain trauma, the organic brain trauma that occurs not only from concussion, but from chronic traumatic encephalopathy through microconcussive hits to a head, through playing sports like rugby and boxing and so forth. And so I'm not asking you to answer to this, but I am saying we really need to think about the fact that we're forcing boys to tackle. We're not forcing girls, we're forcing boys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question for the Minister.
I'll be very quick, I promise. Well, I say that, but... hi, my name's Deborah Powney. I'm a PhD candidate, and I examine male and female victims of intimate partner violence. But one of the things that highlighted to me is, it's brilliant that you're here, is that we're too late in the intervention when, for any suicide, but for us particularly in this instance for men.
Yeah.
Now, I'm very lucky that the school that my children go to is very small, and we get to know the teachers very, very quickly and very intimately, and we're all involved in the school. And I've noticed that over the last couple of years, there's been a real drive, and rightly so, about relationship education for young children. And being who I am, I got very mouthy about the fact that it was about relationship firstly involved with with girls and around consent.
Yeah.
And there was a real emphasis on the fact that boys needed to get consent for girls, which I agree with it initially, and then kicked off about it had to be both ways. But one of the things I've really pressed for at the school is about education about the vulnerability of boys and men. Yeah. Because we're missing not only the appreciation that men don't know what's happening to them, they may not react to depression and suicide ideation, but also the huge empathy gap that exists and the expectation from women that men are going to be okay, they're going to be the protectors, all the rest of it. And it might be a key to getting in, the state getting into the psyche of men and women at a very early age. And we could associate all of that as a relationship education, as opposed to it's all about consent.
Actually, you've made some very interesting points there, and I agree with much of what you say. And I think it goes back to, when we're in our homes as children, what we experience is normal, and that's what we think everyone does. So if you are in an abusive domestic situation, you're just going to think that's normal. So guess what? You're going to go to school, and you're going to behave that way towards your classmates. So, and we're seeing increasingly, behaviours within the classroom between boys and girls that are really inappropriate. But the boy has learned that, and unless we're actually putting those steps in place before.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there because it's not about a boy. It's not about a boy learning this. This is about an expression of trauma. We've heard about that this morning, but this is. I hate to use you as an example, but this is the example we're up against. This is what we have to battle against every day because I see girls behaving in that manner.
Absolutely.
And it's not, it's the child. The child is behaving like that. And beyond, going back to your role of suicide, we need to get out of the idea that children behave a certain way and that's going to carry on. What we need to understand, just educate children on, it's okay not to be okay, whether you're a boy or a girl.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the point you asked me about was about the fact that education is too much about girls and consent. That's what I was trying to address. I apologise if I did it clumsily, because that's absolutely not what I meant. But I think what I'm trying to say is, if we can equip children early enough with the right values, the right understanding about all of this, then they can understand what isn't normal, and then can take those steps to actually start to protect and address their own particular needs. So I am agreeing with you clumsily. I think we need, the announcement that the Secretary of State for Education made with regard to relationship and sex education, it's got to be from the primary school, and it's got to be based on respect, and as much as consent. And we just need to make sure that we are just really tackling what are very aggressive behaviours that we're increasingly witnessing on the part of children who frankly are victims, and unfortunately by the time they start militating into bad behaviour, we then start to teach them as the problem, and that's got to stop.
I quite agree.
We're going to take just one more question, because you've got the Minister here. It's a good opportunity. Just one last question. This is the last.
I'll be very quick. I just want to reiterate how glad we are to have you here and listening about these issues. You spoke about some risk factors. You spoke about relationship breakdown and addiction. I didn't hear any mention of employment cessation and economic downturn, and that's one of the key predictors of and risk factors for suicide in men. And we actually see that there is evidence to suggest there is a spike in male suicide during economic downturn. And so what I wanted to ask was whether you feel it's your job as the suicide minister to lobby against a no-deal Brexit that would compromise jobs of many men and women in the country. I'm sorry, I'm doing it because it's a legitimate question.
I thought if I came to this conference, I wouldn't hear the B word.
No.
Right. First thing, debt. Absolutely, debt is a massive driver of suicide, and that is obviously due to personal economic situations, but obviously gambling and so on does fuel that. One of the things that we're doing, I'm working very closely with DWP. Because we do know that some of the processes through which benefits claimants go through can be very dehumanising, and we need to be better at doing that. So there's that work going on. You could get me started on the whole Brexit situation. I think the most important thing actually that government can do is to provide economic certainty for people. And right now, while we're stuck in limbo, we haven't got that. So we just need to press on and give some certainty. Clearly, there are always adverse economic consequences to very many external events, and we just have to make sure that we do our best to mitigate them.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie, for your time.
Thank you.